Moonlight stretches over rippling waves, seemingly going on forever. Forever. The word tames her wild soul. And there, standing far too close to the edge, the wind in her hair, the night in her hands, she felt closer to it than she ever had. She always did this, in her acts of desperation, releasing a tattered breath, looking to the oceans, seeing herself in the indigo waters, imagining them running crimson, coursing alive with her own lifeblood. Only then, she existed everywhere but within herself. A force of femininity, divinity. Her ghost leaped from the cliffs. For this moment, she was truly immortal. This is Mirrors, a collection of horrors, history, and hauntings. I'm your host, Gabby. This is our very first episode of the new year, so happy 2025, everybody. I am very, very excited about all that is to come this year. Starting with today's episode, which has been a long time coming, because I've known about this story for years now. I've been so fascinated by it, and I've been kind of waiting until I was able to visit this location to delve more into the details of everything. But before we get into it, I have some business to attend to. I am starting to post weekly vlogs, and it's on the same exact channel that I've been posting the audio for the podcast on YouTube. But I've been wanting to expand into video, and I wanted it to be something separate from the podcast just because I love the audio format. Like, I just love the storytelling aspect of it. I love the personal feel of it. So I wanted it to be something different. And I also wanted something that would allow me to share more with you, more of my journey with the paranormal, more of my life beyond the 20-30 minutes that you're listening to me on the mic, and also kind of the behind the scenes of being an independent podcaster in my 20s, getting my life and career started. So that is what my channel will be. It will be about um, living in one of the most haunted places in the world as a horror writer and paranormal investigator. It'll be about hosting a podcast, um, visiting haunted places, videos of my investigations, all different things about hauntings and creativity. I think that there's a lot of different possibilities with it. So I feel really good about that. I already have one video up, so make sure to go watch it, subscribe, turn on all notifications so you see new videos. They'll be out every Friday at 11:11 a.m. So there's that. And that being said, I decided to put a pause on the Patreon, just so that I could focus on the YouTube and that I wasn't like neglecting that space. But I greatly appreciate the support over there. Anyone who was subscribed, you will not be charged anymore. But you can still go on there and download any of the content I had up so far. So I'll potentially be going back to the Patreon in the future. But for now, I just wanted to focus on the main feed and the YouTube. If you would like to support me, which is totally optional, you guys support me so much already by just listening. But if you do wish to help me out with future projects, traveling for investigations, I have a Buy Me a Coffee, which I'll link in the episode description. Basically, it's exactly what it sounds like. You just donate like coffees, and it helps me out a lot. So that'll be in the description if you want to learn more about that. Anyway, I've talked long enough. Let's get into the story. We start today's episode on the coast of Connecticut, at Seaside Sanatorium, a decaying building overlooking the gentle waves of the Long Island Sound, a symbol of lost hope. Seaside Sanatorium was opened in the 1930s to treat children with tuberculosis. This was at a time when tuberculosis wasn't really understood, so the only treatment for those infected was to get sunlight and fresh air, making this sunny seaside location seem ideal. The 45 beds quickly filled up, with Seaside Sanatorium being the first medical facility to offer this type of care, known as heliotropic treatment. The belief here was that the sun and air would induce the production of nitric oxide and vitamin D, boosting the immune system. And while it may have been effective to some degree, Seaside and other sanatoriums were left behind in favor of drug therapies in the 40s. The buildings went on to be used as a home for the elderly and then a treatment center for those with developmental disabilities, before being left abandoned in the late 90s. In 2014, the land was established as a state park. You can't go inside, but you can explore the grounds and see what remains of Seaside Sanatorium. It has been investigated as well, and what's interesting about this location in particular is how many EVPs have been caught, which are electronic voice phenomena, with the belief being that spirit voices are picked up through technology on voice recorders and are not heard by the human ear in real time. So that's just an interesting thing. I did some EVP sessions while I was outside and I didn't catch anything, but that is a common thing that people have been able to pick up while exploring, which is really cool. It was important to me to make it a part of this trip because it represents the significance of tuberculosis in New England's history. And it shows the lack of treatment for and scientific knowledge of tuberculosis, which went on for a long time. Tuberculosis was once a leading cause of death, claiming 2% of New England's population between 1786 and the early 1800s. Tuberculosis weakened the immune system, suppressed the appetite, and caused abnormal cell death. It caused lesions that would leak fluid or air into the lining of the lung, causing difficulty breathing or collapsed lung. People's bodies were essentially shutting down, leaving families and communities to fight a disease that was spreading rapidly, both internally and to other people, with no known, consistently effective treatment. Let's look to the Brown family of Exeter, Rhode Island, one of many obliterated by this illness. Yet, they stand out amongst the masses, for they are at the center of what has become known as the New England vampire panic. This is the story of Mercy Brown. As a child, Mercy Brown watched her mother, Mary Eliza, a strong, healthy woman who spent her days on the family farm, become a shell of herself before succumbing to her mysterious illness. This, although, was only the first tragedy the Brown family would endure. 3 years later, in 1886, her sister, Mary Olive, a 20-year-old dressmaker, a woman well loved in her community, fell ill and died as well. The illness they were suffering was tuberculosis, more commonly known as consumption, because it quite literally consumed the body. A primary source depicts what it would have been like to witness someone declining due to consumption. The emancipated figure strikes one with terror, the forehead covered with drops of sweat, the cheeks painted with a livid crimson, the eyes sunk, the breath offensive, quick and laborious, and the cough so incessant as to scarce allow the wretched sufferer time to tell his complaints. Think of the effect this had. All of the different biological functions disrupted and destroyed. Consumption was almost supernatural, slowly and cruelly drawing life from its victims. A small community like Exeter needed something to blame. Something, no doubt, under the influence of the devil. And they found their answers by looking to their loved ones, sick and suffering, right there before their eyes. Their skin was pale, devoid of the color and humanity they once possessed. They were seeing things, screaming about phantoms in the middle of the night, and occasionally they'd lurch forward in their coughing fits, expelling blood from their mouths. There were monsters at play, creatures crafted from evil, once thought to exist only in storybooks and whispered folklore. No, they were real, and they were invading. And thus, the New England vampire panic ensued. Okay, so obviously, these people were not actually vampires, nor were they being fed on by vampires. They were sick with an illness that, like we've established, was not understood on a scientific level. Also, germ theory, although established in 1861, was not widely recognized, so there was no explanation for why consumption was spreading in the way that it was. Tuberculosis is a highly infectious bacterial disease that can spread when an infected person coughs, sneezes, or talks. So, living in close quarters was bound to cause spread. There was also the heavy grief, the repeated blows of loss that families were facing. People wanted some reason to grasp a hold of, something to make sense of the real life horrors they were living. A few years passed in the Brown family before Mercy's younger brother, Edwin, started showing signs of infection, suffering intense dreams of suffocation and drowning in addition to his physical ailments. Edwin was sent to a spa in Colorado Springs, hoping to receive treatment. The thought was the mountain air and western climate would help him regain his health. And his condition actually did improve, until he received the news of yet another family death. This time, Mercy herself had died. Lena Mercy Brown, born into a farming family in Exeter, Rhode Island, died at just 19 years old on January 17th, 1892. Mercy had what was known as the galloping type of tuberculosis, meaning she was likely infected but asymptomatic for a long time, and she died quickly after first showing signs of illness. This would have been shocking, given the other cases in the family were long and drawn out, at the very least giving them time to wrestle with their own realities. Upon his return to Rhode Island, Edwin's condition worsened. At night, he'd cry out, "She haunts me, and she wants me to come with her." It was then that the town's fear of vampirism found its target: the women of the Brown family. Out of desperation to save his son, and under mounting pressure from the townspeople, George Brown led a small group to the cemetery on the morning of March 17th, 1892, just a few weeks after Mercy's death. There, they exhumed the bodies of his wife and daughters. I can't imagine what he was feeling. First of all, like having that pressure from outside people to do that, but then to make the decision and be there to witness it after already losing so much is just horrific. And then also the confusion of having these accusations thrown at his family. It's really challenging to imagine that. Upon exhuming Mary Eliza and Mary Olive's bodies, they were found to be sufficiently decomposed, which was to be expected given the fact that they'd been buried for many years at this point. But Mercy's body showed little signs of decomposition and was full of blood. This heightened the town's suspicion, and right there in the cemetery, they removed Mercy's heart and liver. And while it's impossible to figure out what train of thought led them to do this, Mercy's organs were burned in a ritualistic manner. The ashes mixed into a tonic that was then consumed by Edwin Brown. Mercy was believed to be a vampire, feeding on the soul of her younger brother, having caused the deaths of her mother and sister and countless others. Her heart, thought to be the center of her vampiric essence, ripped from her corpse by those lost in a desperate fear and hatred. They believed that Edwin drinking the ashes would end the family's curse and cure him, although he too died just 2 months later in May. George went on to live a quiet life, having no further involvement with the New England vampire panic, although continuing to lose children to consumption after his family was out of the public view. Records from the Rhode Island Historical Society show that Annie Laura Brown, Jenny Adeline Brown, and Myra Frances Brown all died of consumption. Only his fifth-born daughter, Hattie Mae, survived and went on to get married and have children. George Brown also would have been alive to see the creation of a vaccine and to see the world learning about what consumption and tuberculosis is and how to prevent it and treat it. Meanwhile, Mercy Brown lives on as the last vampire in New England. But let's once again go back and refer to the science. Mercy's body had been stored in an above-ground tomb, and it had only been a few weeks since she passed, and it was winter in New England. So her body would have likely been preserved to an extent, explaining the lack of decomp. She was not feeding on her family. She was a girl, living in a family that was just one of many unfortunate enough to be struck by consumption. Mercy likely would have lived as other girls of the time lived, assisting with household chores, cooking, cleaning, and helping to run the family farm. She likely would have gone to school to learn basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. And she would have attended church with her family. She went by Lena and grew up in Exeter, which was a small, tight-knit community, much like other New England towns decimated by illness, warfare, and mass movement out west. Today, Mercy's gravesite in Chestnut Hill Cemetery is listed as one of the most haunted spots in New England, primarily because her story remains the most documented case of the New England vampire panic. People have reported cold spots around the grave, as well as seeing shadows or hearing cries in the cemetery. Paranormal encounters, as well as a fascination with vampires, is what keeps visitors going to her grave. I'll be honest, that's why I went. After all, I do credit my Edward Cullen obsession with first introducing me to the dark and mysterious. So I've always been interested in vampire lore, and that's how I came across Mercy's story. And then to learn about the paranormal side of it was really interesting. Fun fact, Bram Stoker actually had clippings of newspaper articles about Mercy Brown, found in his things while writing Dracula. So it's never been stated that that was like the main inspiration. I doubt it was. I'm sure he was writing it for long before he came across the story, but it's cool to know that he would have possibly incorporated this actual event into Dracula in some way, just knowing how that has truly shaped the horror genre and specifically vampire horror. Once I found Mercy's grave, I started to get out my equipment to see if I could document any of those temperature changes or any shifts in electromagnetic energy or anything like that. But I decided not to. I think actually being there broke through this sensationalized story and helped me connect with the emotion at the core of it all. Standing over Mercy's grave, as well as those of her parents and siblings, I thought first of George. I felt his presence really strongly there, and just the helplessness he would have felt watching so many of his family experience such a dramatic physical decline, mirrored by the helplessness he must have felt facing increasing pressure to literally exhume the bodies of his wife and daughters. The defeat he must have felt having that done to Mercy, to then still lose his son and 3 other children. And then I thought of Mercy, who was stolen from her rest after a life of grief and unrest, no doubt feeling a sense of betrayal from her town and her own father. Mercy, whose name still lives on because of suspicion and lies created against her. I had this really sad, heavy feeling for Mercy and the entire Brown family. I've always been motivated by the human element of the paranormal, approaching each investigation with the utmost respect for the people I'm trying to communicate with. But visiting Mercy Brown's grave encouraged me to go deeper in terms of the emotional side of hauntings. My road trip was meant to teach me to conduct more detailed, effective investigations, with each stop on my trip representing a different element of an investigation. From Union Cemetery, I realized the importance of observation, slowing down and really taking in my surroundings. Here, I learned that perhaps what I bring to an investigation is my empathy. I've always thought I may be an empath, and I've been told this by a lot of spiritual advisors over the years. I've also done enough therapy in my time that I do consider myself quite emotionally intelligent and perceptive. Maybe it's just the result of being in these places and knowing their history, and then my creative mind filling in the blanks. But as a writer, a poet, I know the power and beauty of human emotion. And that's why being in these physical spaces is such an important part of this project, even if it's a quick stop on a road trip. Chestnut Hill Cemetery is particularly interesting because, yes, it's where the Brown family's bodies are buried, but it's also where the gruesome exhumation and cremation of Mercy's organs actually took place, which in itself was traumatic and emotionally charged on many different levels. On the right side of the cemetery, there's a small stone receiving vault, which just kind of is there. Like, you wouldn't really look twice at it, I guess. But that's actually where Mercy's body was examined. Being on the Connecticut coastline, standing on the cliffs, looking up to the broken windows of Seaside Sanatorium, imagining children looking out over the water, just hoping to feel better. That was really emotional for me as well. The paranormal is rooted in humanity and how emotion lives on past a physical death. Also, like, bringing in my own grief with the story that I shared on the last episode, um, just to think about that and like connecting with the emotion of someone's spirit and feeling them through that. It really helped me when sitting down to write this week's script. I always try to place myself in the history to visualize the stories as I explore the places where they actually happened. But being here took this all to a new level. I was more mindful in considering each person in the story: Mercy, George, Edwin, the townspeople, and how their perspectives were influenced by historical context. And this was really useful for me in my preparation for the Lizzie Borden house, which is the location of an unsolved murder with so many different perspectives and possibilities. So, really doing the work and deep diving into each person involved really helped me in my investigation. Also, learning a lot about the place and how specific details of life in that place at that time would influence the haunting. I never like mindfully considered before, I don't think. So overall, this was uh a really fascinating place to visit, and the story is just wild. It's one of those things that you can't believe actually happened, but it did. It was really nice to see Mercy's grave. There were lots of flowers left for her. I hope that she was able to find some rest in her afterlife. The gravestone itself also is reinforced because it is such a popular grave, and they didn't want anybody damaging it or stealing it. So It's obviously a place that a lot of people are going to see, and hopefully going with respect to honor mercy. So that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you all so much for listening. I'll be back next week with my next stop. And that one's going to be a little bit different. But until then, stay spooky. This has been Mirrors, Horrors, History, and Hauntings. Produced and hosted by Gabby Hope Fry.